I'd like to welcome everyone to our first inaugural talk of the Hispanic and Latin American Studies Film Club. And what a better way to end our Halloween week than a talk about La Llorona. And I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Bernadette Marie Calafell. She is the chair and professor of critical race and ethnic studies at Gonzaga University. And she is going to talk about one of my favorite topics also, I have to admit. The title of her paper today is American Dreams, American Nightmares, La Llorona, Race, and Politics. And if you'd like to save your questions until the end of the presentation, that would be great. And I will now hand over the screen, I guess, so to speak, to Dr. Calafell.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Dr. Santos for inviting me, and I'm going to share a screen with you. So let me pull this up for you. Okay. As you can see, this is the title of my presentation that we just said. So, W. Scott Poole writes, 2 months before the election of Donald Trump, clowns began appearing at the edge of the woods. In the last hot summer days of August 2016, children living at the Fleetwood Manor apartment complex in the deeply conservative city of Greenville, South Carolina, told their parents about figures in paint with bulbous red noses attempting to lure them into the woods. Local police found nothing and no one, but the painted phantoms kept coming for the children in rumor panic that spread across the nation with particular resonance in deeply conservative states that Trump won decisively in November. I start with Poole because the figure of the clown has certainly gained prominence since the election of Donald J. Trump, and because in this talk I'll ruminate on the figure in relationship to the figure of La Llorona. To consider the role of horror in the Trump era, to make sense of or make meaning of the societal, cultural, and political moment. Specifically, I will unpack and juxtapose the meanings around Mexican motherhood in the film, The Curse of La Llorona, with memes and discourses that position Trump as Pennywise, the murderous clown from It. These representations work in concert to manufacture consent for family separation and the treatment and detention of migrant children at the border. Now, I'm drawing on work that has been in progress, as well as some recent work with one of my former graduate students, Stephanie Farajado. However, before I do that, I want to briefly situate my perspective and offer an overview of some of my previous scholarship. So Platts and Muhato argue one of the best ways to gain insight into how a society grapples with large-scale social change is through the references to horror cinema, the very genre designed to scare, unsettle, and otherwise disturb its audience. Horror cinema ebbs and flows in accordance with diffusely felt trauma, whereby it functions as a conduit for the negative. For many, the 2016 presidential election was a horror film incarnate, with a lot of people finding themselves genuinely afraid of losing their livelihoods, their liberties, and the lovely graces of their planet. During the campaign, candidate Trump nakedly trafficked in horrific tropes. And taking a historical perspective to the study of monsters, Poole argues American monsters are born out of American history. They emerge out of the central anxieties and obsessions that have been part of the United States from colonial times to the present, and from the structures and processes where these obsessions found historical expression. While other scholars such as Barbara Creed have drawn on psychoanalytic perspectives to understand representations of horror and monstrosity, Poole argues that monsters are outside of the human psyche, instead grounded in history. These monstrous narratives not only shape identities, they provide a space to hold conversations about our public anxieties. Our monsters register our national traumas. Poole further elaborates that monsters are real in the sense that they not only symbolize, but also help us to configure worldviews and play a role in those worldviews. Monstrous narratives can be read as a response to a rapidly changing social, cultural, political, economic, and moral landscape. Kendall Phillips asks, what are we to make of those films that have tapped into the collective fears of an entire generation? Can we have what film theorist Robin Wood calls collective nightmares? Phillips argues that the success and influence of particular horror films can be correlated to broader cultural anxieties into somehow which they tapped. And similar to Phillips, I ask, What are the collective monstrosities that tap into broader cultural anxieties? Now, both Poole and Phillip greatly informed my thinking about monstrosity in popular culture. Each guide and pushed me to consider monstrosity not as lingering within the psyche, but instead intimately connected to our past, presence, and futures as a society. As a critical cultural studies scholar, my scholarly and personal commitments lie squarely in the questions of identities: race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, and ability. And a Chicana feminist ethic further impels me to recognize the intersectional nature of our identities and how intersectionalities inform monstrosities. I further understand how our identities work together to shape our experiences, how we experience the world, and how others experience us. As Halberstam notes, monsters are meaning-making machines. They can represent gender, race, nationality, class, and sexuality in one body. And my approach is further guided by the work of Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, in particular his 7 Theses on monster culture. Cohen's 7 Theses in many ways operate similar to Poole and Phillip's work. However, they offer an overarching framework to think about monstrosity. Cohen argues that the monster's body is a cultural space, meaning that it's an embodiment of a certain cultural moment, of a time, a feeling, and a place. The monster's body quite literally incorporates fear, desire, anxiety, and fantasy, giving them life and an uncanny independence. The monstrous body is pure culture. And likewise, Stephen Asma asserts that the inhumanity of monsters tells us a great deal about our own cultural morals. Cohen further asserts that the monster's body dwells at the gates of difference, and often comes to represent race, nationality, class, gender, ability, and sexuality. Not only do monsters ask us how we perceive the world, they ask us to reevaluate our cultural assumptions about race, gender, and sexuality, our perception of difference and tolerance towards its expression, and they ask us why we've created them. So in 2015, my book, Monstrosity, Race, and Performance in Contemporary Culture was published, and the text takes a critical approach to the study of monstrosity to consider both literal and figurative or symbolic representations of monstrosity, ranging from an examination of the Aurora, Colorado theater shooter James Holmes and the monstrosity of whiteness in that case, to monstrosity in the Gloria Anzaldúa archives. In 2018, I edited a special issue of the Journal of Popular Culture Studies on monstrosity. Most recently, I've been working with Marina Levina and Kendall Phillips as a co-editor of the new Horror and Monstrosity series through the University of Mississippi Press. And over the last few years, I've been interested in the emergence of horror films in the 2000s that can be understood within the frame of feminist horror. For example, I've written about The Lords of Salem, American Mary, and A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which emerged in a time period which has been characterized by many as continuing to wage war on women, and certainly this is not coincidental. The rise of conservative politics post 9/11 and the presidency of George W. Bush led to not only increased variations of surveillance and restriction, but also more calls for proposed legislation that would decrease women's control over their own reproductive rights and health, which we've currently seen what has happened in the United States. Coupled with these calls, in the media there was a nostalgic turn to the past and flagrant images of hegemonic masculinity through shows like Mad Men, The Playboy Club, and Pan Am. The rise in conservatism and nostalgia can be tied to the 2008 election of Barack Obama. As many whites, particularly white men, symbolically saw their power in decline, calls emerged for organizing, like the White Men's March. Ironically, running concurrent with this backlash was a rise in discourses that espoused the birth of a post-racial and post-feminist period. This sense of increased paranoia in the US society post 9/11, the election of Obama, and a collapsing economy that points to the unrealistic nature of the American dream create powerful context for understanding these films, as well as the film La Llorona, and their connection to female agency. These films point to the limits of post-feminism and post-feminist sensibility that pervades modern US culture, and illustrate how horror text makes sense of what it means to be young, female, and post-feminist in the early 21st century. More recently, I've been doing work connected to race and horror in an analysis of Get Out. And I want to talk just a little bit about it because it's kind of like a precursor here to La Llorona. So it's important to talk about the context for that, because it's kind of a context for this current project as well. Recent studies have shown that a majority of whites say discrimination against them exists in America today and is a bigger problem as discrimination against racial minorities. There is also a growing sense among whites that white men have been denied quote-unquote rightful opportunities because of perceived increased focus on diversity. Furthermore, we see white women using their voices to support white patriarchy and racialized violence. The previously mentioned studies can be understood in relationship to events such as the Abigail Fisher Supreme Court case, touting discourses of reverse racism and attacks against affirmative action, which we again are dealing with now, and the continual state-sanctioned violence and murder of African Americans by the police. These studies must be placed in conversation with discourses of post-racialism after the 2008 election of Barack Obama and his subsequent re-election in 2012. As Coates suggests, Obama, his family, and his administration were a walking advertisement for the ease with which Black people could be fully integrated into unthreatening mainstream of American culture, politics, and myth, and that was always the problem. Obama's presidency assaulted the most deeply rooted notions of white supremacy and instilled fear in its adherents and beneficiaries. It became clear, as Coates notes, that race is not simply a portion of the Obama story, it's the lens through which many Americans view all his politics. Similarly, Eric King Watts argues that fantasies of the post-racial depend on and reanimate the effective economies concurrent in the objection of Blackness. This is so because the post-racial is not a space-time of racial absence or of racial transcendence. It does not signify the dissolution of the brutality of racism. It does not mark the beginning of a universal humanity, and yet it is not an absurd fiction either. Rather, it registers a recurring traumatic condition triggered by ruptures or fractures of a society felt as threats to the imaginary and symbolic status of masculine whiteness. And as I've discussed in my previously published work, this context sets the stage for the reemergence of racial nostalgia for the 50s and hegemonic masculinity that led to the films such as American Mary and The Lords of Salem, which I mentioned in terms of post-feminist horror. Certainly, the facade of the post-racial was publicly ripped away from many white liberals by the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the increased visibility and mainstream acceptance of white supremacist groups under the banner of the alt-right or white nationalism. The rhetoric of forgotten people or victimized whiteness rematerialized even more strongly. Additionally, Allison Reed draws on Wegman, who discusses the white liberal tendency toward a kind of victimized whiteness born out of a class solidarity or historical patterns of immigration and racialization. This leads to fallacious claims to pre-white injury, in part motivated by affirmative action backlash and set into motion by a guise of revolutionary discursive Blackness that simultaneously particularizes and disidentifies with the political power of white skin. This discursive Blackness is guilty of participating in, indeed actively forging, a counter whiteness whose primary characteristic is its disaffiliation from white supremacist practices. The strategic alignment of discursive Blackness and deracinated whiteness reproduces white supremacy under the banner of progressivism. And it's in this context that we situate and understand Jordan Peele's 2017 film Get Out, which revisits the Guess Who's Coming to Dinner narrative through the lens of horror. The narrative unfolds when, during a weekend visit to meet his white girlfriend Rose's family, Chris discovers the family uses a process they call the coagula procedure to place parts of their brains, their consciousness, in the bodies of African Americans, rendering them as vessels for white consciousness. In a sense, they become zombies, which Watts suggests operates a contradictory relation to the logics of the post, as it recalls histories of terror, horror, revulsion, slavery, rape, and violence. Through hypnosis by Rose's mother, Missy, the consciousness of their victims are placed in what Missy terms the sunken place. Chris comes to find out his girlfriend and her family's true motives as they violently attempt to perform the procedure on him after he's been auctioned off to the highest bidder in a scene that harkens back to slave auctions. While many might rightfully focus on the character of Chris and what his reputation means in this contemporary moment, my interest has been in the representation of Black women in the film, especially as their position in relationship to whiteness and Black masculinity. Kenitra Brooks marks the lack of criticism focused on representations of Black women within horror, and she insists that Black women horror characters, when present, are plagued by their construction as a mistreated tool used to further the more careful considerations of other characters. Considering identity in politics, Sexton asks us to consider what a shift from a narrow emphasis on the attack of Black masculine empowerment, what used to be called manhood rights, to a far more expansive formulation of assault on Black reproductive freedom might mean. What might it mean if we stand on its head the patriarchal assumption that Black women's suffering is a disgrace to Black men and rethink gendered violence against Black men as a component of gendered violence against Black women? And much like Kara Killing's analysis of the Black lesbian femme character, Ursula, and Set It Off, I've been interested in what we can learn from the character of Georgina, a woman who we are introduced to as working for Rose's family, yet we come to find out is housing the consciousness of Rose's grandmother. And so following dominant logics that frame Blackness through masculinity and womanhood through whiteness, I've explored how this film dismisses the possibility or erases possibilities of femme queerness in favor of a critique that focuses on the violence enacted against Black masculinity and heterosexuality that echoes towards a narrow vision of Black nationalism. The film positions Black women as complicit actors in white supremacy, while Black men perform agency through body knowledges or theories in the flesh, as theorized by feminists of color. However, like Douglas, I'm not interested in reifying gender stratification. Rather, I want to use a Black feminist lens to be inclusive of all genders. And Georgina exists in what Sharon Holland terms a queer space, which is not necessarily based on acts in which individuals engage, but instead the coercive norms that place their desires into a position of conflict with the present order. So, having briefly talked about some of my previous scholarship as a way to set up what I'm doing in this talk with La Llorona, I want to return to the figure of the clown, specifically Pennywise from It and the Joker from Joker. Poole suggests that early on, critics linked Trump to the figure of the clown, including those from more traditionally conservative media. Mary Vail of The Guardian called Trump a gigantic killer clown who used his supporters' despair and hopelessness against them. Poole argues the age of Trump has seen the apotheosis of the clown archetype, symbol, and nightmare folklore and film. He continues the clown in horror narratives with his obsessive appeal and dangerous terror offers the key to understanding Trump's own politics of horror. Clown horror engages in a brand of poison nostalgia for small-town America, imagined as facing a dire threat. Second, most cinematic representations of clown horror depend on a sense of abbreviated masculinity that explodes in chaotic violence. The inhumane face of the psychotic clown acts as a symbol for American acceptance. Indeed, its obsession with unexpected and unpredictable violence. It's the same face worn by the 45th president, silly, pathetic, and without exactly sad, and seemingly making a bottomless potential for social and cultural geopolitical mayhem. From American Horror Story Cult to It Parts 1 and 2, and recently Joker, we can see clowns emerging in popular culture. And similarly, we see mashups featuring Trump as Pennywise or face painted as the Joker in the tradition of Heath Ledger's rendition. Aside from this, pundits describe Trump's appearance and behavior as often framed as outlandish and clownish. The popularity of the Joker as a representation of incel culture, which in many cases is tied to white supremacist movements, is not coincidental. Additionally, incels, or involuntary celibates, are steeped in misogyny and general feelings of hate, anger, entitlement, alienation, and anti-socialism. Certainly, someone who espouses of women that you just need to grab them by the pussy echoes the entitlement shared by incels, such as the Santa Barbara, California shooter, whose manifesto decried his inability and anger about not being able to find a girlfriend or any woman to give him attention. Poole suggests that the nihilism that lurks behind the mask of the grim injustice really only finds true expression in the Joker's savage willingness to take the use of violence to its illogical conclusion. And certainly we can see why the Joker has been connected to Trump, as some might suggest. He too is operating with a savage willingness to take the use of violence to its illogical conclusion, such as in the case of engagements with Iran or January 6th. However, what interests me most is the mixing of Trump with Pennywise the Clown, the evil villain in It, who kidnaps and kills children in the 1980s. Nostalgia for the 80s, when Reagan wanted to make America great again, looms large in this film. And likewise, Poole suggests that It also displayed an obsession with the fetish of male domination, while Christensen and Hester write that It Part 1 is focused on reifying the idea of young white male innocence. Teresa Geller notes that nostalgia and banal message of the film hews a little too closely to make America great again. She argues that it is the first horror film to truly represent Trump's America. Geller writes, certainly in the recent Unite the Right protests in Charlottesville were impelled by a similar sentiment as it. They too stick together and relied on one another's strength and loyalty and goodness in order to protest in words and deeds now openly expressed under Trump's regime, those they perceived as evil. And Poole shares that these expressions of clown horror suggest that Trumpism may be abhorrent, but it's not an aberration in America's deeply violent history. Its roots run deep in the violent settler societies from which the U.S. emerged, but has gained a special pungency in the last 50 years that preceded and in some ways paved the way for the rise of Trumpism. The clown and its uncanny powers, monstrous intentions, and its alchemy of violence and nostalgia reveals the social machinery of power in post-industrial America, Trump's America. Even Comedy Central's South Park jumped on the connection between Trump and Pennywise the Clown in Splatty Tomato, episode 10 of season 21, in which Mr. Garrison, now fashioned as President Trump, returns to South Park in sightings that are scaring the local children. So, released in 2017, it predated Trump's 2018 mass detaining of migrants and caging of innocent children, but it's not a hard leap to see how the image of Trump as Pennywise could take another level of significance, given not only the detainment, but deaths of and sexual violence against innocent children. A year later, in 2019, we would see the release of the major motion picture, The Curse of La Llorona, as a part of the successful Conjuring horror universe. And I want you to keep Trump as Pennywise in the back of your mind for a moment. The film grossed over $54 million in the US and over $123 million worldwide. The Curse of La Llorona begins with a very brief scene that references the story of La Llorona beginning in 1673. After she murders her children, we are then taken to 1973, which is interesting given the contemporary calls for nostalgia to make America great again, as well as constant comparisons between the Nixon presidency and the Trump presidency. Very quickly, the film introduces the audience to three major female characters: La Llorona, Patricia Alvarado, and Ana Tate Garcia. Anna is a white woman and is introduced as hardworking and stressed widow who is trying to maintain a functioning household after the death of her Latino police husband. Patricia is a Mexican-American mother being investigated by Anna, who is a social worker, because she is suspected of child abuse and neglect. Patricia uses mystical and occult methods to try and protect her two young sons from being harmed by La Llorona. However, Anna, her social worker, interferes and takes the two boys under custody of the Child Protective Services. This interference is deadly as La Llorona gains access to the boys who are no longer being protected by their mother, and she drowns them in a nearby river. Patricia blames Anna for the death of her sons while also being a suspect in their deaths. Out of rage, the audience later finds out, Patricia sends La Llorona after Anna's children, and the plot is set into motion. Progressively, Anna and her children experience the terror of La Llorona and begin to look for ways to protect themselves. Anna's eldest son, Chris, tries to imitate his late policeman father in defense of his sister, Sam, but is not effective. As a family, they look to a Catholic priest who says he cannot help, and they're sent to a curandero named Rafael. The curandero is a Latino and distrustful of Anna and her family at first, but eventually agrees to help. Rafael gives Anna and her family instructions on how to protect themselves against La Llorona, and they very closely resemble the methods that Patricia used in the beginning of the film. Rafael sets a trap for La Llorona and is successful in expelling her from the house, but a mistake by Sam lets her in again. La Llorona chases the children up into the attic, and there's a moment when La Llorona is humanized in a flashback of her children when Chris presents her with a necklace she received as a gift, but the moment is over when she sees herself in the mirror. Finally, Anna comes in and destroys La Llorona by stabbing her with a cross made of a tree that was a witness to La Llorona's infanticide. Chicana feminists have embraced the figure of La Llorona, the weeping woman, and in some cases tied her to that of Malitzin de Nepal, the indigenous woman who was translator and consort of Hernan Cortez, the Spanish conquistador. Scholars such as Gloria Anzaldúa note that there was a story that 10 years before the Spaniards came to Mexico, there was a woman wailing in the streets of the city of Mexico saying that, proclaiming that the children would be lost, the culture would be lost, the race would be lost, and that she was in effect predicting the coming of the Spaniards and the loss of the tribal culture. When Cortez arrived in Mexico, he was given, and I say that in quotations, Malitzin, who was said to be between 14 to 16 years of age, by Mayan merchants along with 14 other girls. Cortez passed her on to various men during her lifetime. While she's been constructed as a traitor figure or Mexican Eve figure by scholars such as Octavio Paz, who refer to her as La Chingada, or the used woman, who has disgraced us all as Mexicans, Chicana feminists argue that colonialism would have happened with or without her, and she was not of the age of consent. She acted out of deeply religious beliefs to try and help her people as much as possible. In 1521, Malitzin was said to have given birth to a son, and in 1522, as the story goes, Cortez was preparing to return to Spain to marry a Spanish woman and take their mestizo son Martin with him. Betrayed by Cortez, La Malinche realized the role she played in the massacre of her people and prays to her gods for help and guidance. One god answers her prayers and reveals to her that if she permits Cortez to take her son to Spain, that child would one day return to destroy her people. In a mixture of feeling betrayed and abandoned by Cortez and the guilt of having aided him, and again, quotations, in the murder of her people and the prophecy of her son continuing the massacre if she allowed him to leave for Spain, La Malinche escapes one night to the lake and stabs the child in the heart before dropping his lifeless body into the water and crying out, "Oh, hijo mío." La Malinche dies in 1529, and oral tradition has it that she can be seen at lake's edge crying out for her dead child, this distinctive epigraph to many La Llorona accounts. There are multiple tellings of the story, which include various motives about why La Llorona killed her children, including to get back at her cheating husband or to marry a man who didn't want children around. In rehabilitating her story, Maria Figueroa sees infanticide as an act of self-mutilation in response to some form of oppression that has been internalized. In other words, the act is committed in reason against the pain and suffering of oppression. Likewise, Naomi Quinones argues La Llorona selflessly takes the lives of her children to save them from the violence of a world that may destroy them and will kill them. Domino Perez, in a critical reading of the contemporary La Llorona narrative, suggests La Llorona's failure to achieve a white, middle-class, maternal, or familial ideal exposed to the privileged economic, social, political underpinnings of the model American family. I could go on and on here about La Llorona and Malitzin, but I want to return to the film. It's important to contextualize the film within increasing calls to take away women's reproductive rights, anti-Latino rhetorics espoused by the Trump administration, and the increase of white supremacist hate crimes. These issues are salient in U.S. American culture and expressed in The Curse of La Llorona, which provides a catharsis and a sense of resolution for an audience intention. Additionally, discourses surrounding motherhood, patriarchy, memory, and femininity and objection are parallel running in The Curse of La Llorona to current events. Writers such as Pilar Melero and Juan Padilla argue that the myth of La Llorona provides a base for discourses surrounding how women position themselves within the construct of motherhood. They argue motherhood is the center of our identity, out of which women make their choices and of which they construct their agency. Other writers, such as Claudia Herreras, Diana Ferrari, Orquídea Morales, and Cristina Santos, are more concerned with patriarchal structures and how they create the conditions for the creation of La Llorona, as well as how they continue to shape the myth in contemporary society. From these writings, it is implied that La Llorona as monster was created by the violence of patriarchy. According to Gonzalez, Herrera, and Acala, La Malinche has been constructed as synonymous with betrayal, while La Llorona symbolizes destructive motherhood. And Shane Morman and I have examined how the figure of La Llorona in the film Chasing Poppy is used to regulate not only Latino masculinity, but also citizenship. In this big screen retelling of La Llorona's myth, a colonial and patriarchal set of values is being expressed in order to respond to the tensions surrounding Southern immigrants and women. These values are expressed through the different functions and symbols embodied by La Llorona, Patricia, and Anna, as well as Anna's relationship to her children and other characters of color. In this film, Anna is positioned as the middle-class, chaste, protective mother whose whiteness and role as social worker allow her to judge Mexican culture while simultaneously using it to hers and her children's benefit. She could easily symbolically stand in for a large number of white women who've helped elect Trump, or a member of his administration, such as Kristen Nielsen, Patricia is positioned as a poor, superstitious, and neglectful mother, but also as a La Llorona in becoming, as she seeks to kill Anna's children out of revenge for losing her own. Her character is always emotionally distressed and is constantly wronged by the institution of governance that she encounters. She can also symbolically represent the image of Latinas as dangerous by the Trump administration through discourses of mothers wanting to give birth to their children in the U.S. Women demonized as carrying anchor babies, which is not my term, which is the term used by the administration at that time. Thirdly, La Llorona is the monstrous mother who drowned her children out of a jealous rage and is seeking to kill more children to replace her own. Symbols surrounding abortion and feminine instability are embedded in her character, and she is treated as a monster who cannot be redeemed. Patricia and La Llorona function in the film as failed mothers, while Anna, who like the other final girls, is positioned as asexual and solely concerned with the welfare of her children. Anna is also the mother to mixed-race children, which mirrors the archetype of the Virgin of Guadalupe as a symbolic mother of Mexico and mestizo children and mestizo culture. Anna/Guadalupe are the benevolent mothers of mestizo children who are threatened by the transgressive mothers refusing to conform to their prescribed gender roles. Just as Anna is upheld for her mothering, La Llorona and Patricia are cast as irredeemable monsters for their mothering. Anna and the survival of her children can be read as symbolic of the need for Mexican Americans and Latinos to assimilate into U.S. culture. The whiteness of her mixed-race children is part of what allows them to survive. Patricia knows that social services and Anna, as a white woman, cannot understand her within her own cultural context, so she retreats from government help and instead turns to religious tools to help protect her children from La Llorona. Patricia's situation is reminiscent of Malinche because they're both caught up in relationships with authorities of the state and are using the small powers available to them to navigate and survive their situation. The implicit message that's being expressed in the film is that Mexican culture and spiritual knowledge is not important or valuable until it is beneficial to white people. For example, Trump demonizes Mexicans as murderers and rapists, all the while screaming to build a wall that Mexico will pay for. He has illegally employed undocumented workers at his various properties. Thus, we get a similar message in the Curse of La Llorona. The U.S. wants Mexican culture, labor, and resources, but not in any way that considers their needs and safety. It's a racist colonial mentality that continues to subject people of color while simultaneously extracting their culture for white benefit. Just as this mentality is ingrained in the U.S. American culture, it is salient throughout the film. A stereotypical and common trope in the film is that of the emotionally excessive Latina, and both Patricia and La Llorona fit this mold. Patricia is made to be the angry brown woman when she curses Anna's children to be taken by La Llorona out of revenge for having lost her two children. As Morales mentioned, the myth of La Llorona teaches that women are dangerous, and that La Llorona myth in this film teaches that Mexican women are more dangerous than white women. This film has an imbued narrative about the worthiness of motherhood that is coded by race. The character of La Llorona is completely demonized as irredeemable because she chose her feelings over her children, which makes her unworthy of sympathy. Patricia is framed in a similar way by having her be vengeful and attempt to cause the deaths of more children out of the pain of losing her own. Anna, as the protagonist of the film, is framed as worthy of motherhood, even though her children have brown bodies that she uses to gain access toward resources not normally available to her. Anna's whiteness is what saves her and her children because whiteness is portrayed as synonymous with being level-headed, rational, forgiving, and responsible. The issue of intersectionality of identities becomes apparent in the film throughout the layered portrayals of characters to express white supremacist patriarchal values. Using motherhood as a space for discourses also allows inequalities in access to reproductive health between white women and women of color to illustrate where progress needs to be made. Additionally, the attempt made by the government to adopt out migrant children who have been systematically separated from their parents at the southern border is continuing a colonialist erasure of culture. The Curse of La Llorona speaks to the social anxiety surrounding quote-unquote illegal immigration, but again, it rewrites the narrative to absolve whiteness from any culpability. The tagline for this film is, "She wants your children." At the southern border, it is not Mexican, Salvadorian, Honduran, or Guatemalan women who are seeking to take children. It's the U.S. Border Patrol and American white families. These these facts may make some white people uncomfortable and unwilling to engage because it's disruptive for them to acknowledge their complicity in these acts of colonial violence. The impact of this film is held in that it subverts this narrative of colonialism into one that portrays the white woman, an agent of the government, as the good white girl, as the hero, and the Mexican monster as the force-stealing children. The narrative of this film makes it easier to blame Mexican women for the dangers inflicted on their own children, such as saying they are bad parents for bringing them to cross the border, rather than to acknowledge that white Americans and other colonized people of color are complicit in committing acts of violence against children. This displaced blame allows audiences to release their anxieties about their own personal racism or indifference for the suffering of people of color. The director of the film, Michael Chavez, explains in an interview that the choice to make the protagonist an outsider to Mexican culture was intentional, to produce a sense of discovery for the audience. Like Anna in the film, the producers and directors of the film used Mexican culture and mythology for entertainment and palatability of white audiences rather than the community who produced the basis of the story. This supports the claim that the demonization of Mexican women and Mexican motherhood is for the consumption of white audiences in order to justify colonial violence and racism. While the release and timing of the two films, It and The Curse of La Llorona, may be coincidental, certainly the meanings we could take away when reading them together are stark. The positioning of Mexican and Mexican American women as bad mothers who cannot protect and in fact place their children in danger runs concurrent through The Curse of La Llorona, as does the positioning of white women as representatives of the government who are positioned as much better to make decisions about the needs and care of brown children. Latino men are absolved or simply positioned as mediators, such as Rafael, who helps Anna save her children from La Llorona. We have no idea where the father of Patricia's children are, and the only other Latino man mentioned is La Llorona's husband, who fits the stereotype of the hypersexual Latin lover, as he cheated on her, which led to her to kill her children. As we can see in the connection between La Llorona and Malitzin, the theme of bad mother in Mexican and Mexican American cultures is prominent when contrasted in the virgin whore dichotomy as represented through the Virgin of Guadalupe. The Southern Poverty Law Center notes that on May 7, 2018, the Department of Justice implemented its zero-tolerance policy, dictating that all migrants who cross the border without permission, including those seeking asylum, be referred to the DOJ for prosecution. Undocumented asylum seekers were imprisoned, and any accompanying children under the age of 18 were handed to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which shipped them miles away from their parents and scattered them among 100 offices of refugee resettlement shelters and other care arrangements across the country. Hundreds of these children, including infants and toddlers, were under the age of 5. It was noted in November of 2019 that year there were 69,550 migrant children held in custody, while 6 children died in custody between September 2018 and May 2019. And this is not included the number of adults that died in custody of ICE as well. On June 21st, 2018, a date that precedes the release of The Curse of La Llorona, The Onion ran an article titled, "Immigrant Children Terrified as Ghastly Visage of La Llorona Appears in Detention Center," alongside an image of Melania Trump. The story commemorated Trump's visit to a Texan detention center, as she famously wore a jacket with the message on the back, "I really don't care, do you?" Platts and Mulatto note, It was the most financially successful horror film of 2017. They suggest Trump's sociopathic nature was seen as being reflected in Pennywise, a soul-devouring clown who awakens from his 27-year slumber to prey on the town's children. It was Stephen King, the author of It, who stated at a women's march in Florida, "We just elected Pennywise president." Likewise, director Andy Muschietti shared, "Fear is used as a tool these days to divide and conquer, and hate is a tool, and there's something that Pennywise does. That's something resounding in our society right now." The circulation of images of Trump as Pennywise and the meanings associated with The Curse of La Llorona are significant as we look to humanitarian crises at the border. And as Mormon and I have argued in the film, La Llorona has been seen as a guardian or arbiter of U.S. citizenship, and certainly hegemonic ideologies about the paternalism of whiteness, or whiteness as the guardian that knows best, are already circulating at larger cultural levels every day throughout the news. as well as government actions and discourses of representatives, white nationalist movements, as well as conservative evangelical movements. The meanings and messages from these two texts, The Curse of La Llorona and It, augment or support existing attitudes. Brown people, brown children in particular, become less human, expendable, and pawns for the Trump administration. These images work to help secure consent for what's happening at the border by painting Mexican and Latina women as bad mothers who need the government to intercede for the benefit of their children. As I finish up, I want to return to the figure and the discussion I started with of clown sightings. Some suggest they were part of a marketing stunt for an unreleased short film called Gags. Others warn they were a precursor to a threatened clown purge in the vein of the Purge films. While these clowns may be gone for now, we can't ignore the proliferation of the clown image and representations of Trump, particularly as Pennywise, the evil clown, who, like La Llorona, murders children. These clowns in Trump's symbolic role as Pennywise are no laughing matter. While he was coming for brown kids at that time, who knows what the future holds. Were you the member of the Losers Club who band together to defeat Pennywise? Note here that loser is a popular term used by Trump, or will you stand by idly until it's time for him to come for your children? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Calafell. For some reason, we didn't see the progression of your slides.
Oh no! Oh no!
We want to maybe bring up, we can do the open the stream to questions from our audience, and maybe have your PowerPoint in the background, and we can just see the image.
I'll try and
chat away.
Yeah, I'll try it again. Let's see if I can get it up again.
So while we let the live stream catch up to us, I wanted to maybe ask a question around La Llorona and the racial politics.
Yeah. Can you see the images?
Yes, we have them up now. Rather friendly slide. With Trump. I refuse, in my own work, I always refer to him as the 45th president, not to give the team any presence in my work, but that's my own little contribution, so to speak. Could you
I'll go through a couple more.
Sorry?
I'll just go through a couple more so people can see them.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, that's great. And as you're going through them, could you maybe talk a little bit more about the idea that the La Llorona legend is often used as a boogeyman story to make sure that children behave, not go out at night? If we have that prefigurative to the legend of La Llorona, how do you see that translating into this specific context that you have presented to us today?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting is that the film presents that narrative, as you said, like the boogeyman narrative for La Llorona, but within this specific context, it is interesting because the only person that can really save you from La Llorona is a white woman, right? And whiteness gets connected to rationality, whereas the brown mother, Patricia, is connected to emotionality of the body and is seen as irrational, right? And so I think we can think about how the story in this film takes that boogeyman narrative to a whole nother level, that even like we have to be suspicious of our culture in some ways, right? That the path to freedom is connected to whiteness, or the embracing of assimilation in some ways. So that's kind of how I see it happening and building on that narrative.
It's almost like a revisiting of the colonial whitening process, that whole miscegenation that happened with the conquista. And brings to question this the idea of the racialization, the further racialization of good mother versus bad mother, and there's no in between good enough mother. And
exactly.
That it's problematic, especially when you talked about the anchor babies.
Mm-hmm.
That is viewed as part of now this, not only a very patriarchal, confining definition of the good mother and the bad mother. Beautiful. Melania as the Llorona. This whole race, further stereotyping with the question of race now in this film, to me, is doubly concerning.
Yeah, definitely. I guess, yeah, I mean, it really gets us to want to move away, like you said, and it goes back to that colonial narrative, right? Which is horrific. So you've got this kind of layered, racist, sexist narrative, classist narrative.
Yeah. I'm just waiting to see if anybody would like to pop in with a question. I know we have some of our students in the audience. Don't be shy. Pop in with a question you may have. While we wait, I was thinking of going back again to another interesting point, that in addition to the racialization question is the whole discussion around masculinity and the anxiety around masculinity, or in Latin America, machismo, no?
Right.
And when you talked about Get Out, it's almost a fetishization of the male, black male.
Yes.
How do you see these threads coming together?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you said, it's almost this fetishization or hypervisibility of the black male in Get Out. And again, it's like this nationalist narrative that positions the women as kind of like the bystanders or the helpers behind black masculinity. But when we see this film, the thread is that rather than being hypervisible, Latino men are rendered maybe hyper invisible, right? That their masculinity, in an interesting point, you know, like you said, we have this whole history of machismo, right? But we don't, the Latino man is either dead in this film through the police officer husband, or is the curandero who has the power to help get rid of La Llorona, but can't fully do it on his own. So in some ways, Latino masculinity is almost, how do you say it? Like, stifled or made to be, oh gosh, what is the word?
Could you say secondary?
Yes. So I think it's secondary, but almost disempowered in a lot of ways too, which I think could be a good thing in a way to disempower machismo. But we certainly, I think there's something different when we have images of women, Mexicanas or Chicanas, and they have to be the sole representation, right? And of course, the sole representation becomes then this erratic, woman who can't be trusted, the Malinche, La Llorona type, right? And the men don't have any representation or culpability in anything.
Yeah, I just building off of that, I'm checking to see, but students, feel free to ask questions so I don't monopolize the whole question period. When you were talking about, you know, the colonial foundations to the legend of La Llorona, the different variations to it, even foretelling the arrival of the Spaniards in the world. This pops up, a question occurred to me when we were talking about this specific film, talking about the sociopolitical context specifically of the film and these racial social views of what happens in the film, of the Mexican mother or the racialized mother not being the good mother because she believes in the legend and these pre-colonial beliefs, and it has to be the white social worker who comes in to save the day. It's
Right.
almost a second wave colonization
Mm-hmm.
of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like an ideological colonization at a whole nother level, right?
Yeah. And I wonder
Definitely.
to what extent the political ambiance of Trump's administration really kind of fed into this reinsertion.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think Trump's administration definitely made it right for a story like this, in which Latino, because we had this narrative of these women are bringing their children across the border. They really don't care about the safety of their children, and we have to step in and be the benevolent or paternalistic government that is going to do something about it. At the same time, there's the whole build the wall rhetoric, right? So it's this violence enacted at multiple levels in different kinds of rhetorics. One of benevolency, and then one of kind of really strict like violence and othering that feeds more traditional lines of hate rhetoric.
Yeah, and the fact that I find it interesting, there is this subtext that because a social worker doesn't understand that cultural prefigurative, she ends up actually putting her own children at risk with La Llorona.
Right. Yeah.
And my one criticism of this film is the fact that La Llorona's haunting gets situated into the family swimming pool.
Right. Right.
So it's like, it's not free-flowing water that we usually have.
Right.
That allows for movement, like Cisneros, Woman Hollering Creek. There's movement. There's opportunity. There's a chance to progress. Whereas in this film, it's a swimming pool. It's not natural water.
Yeah.
It's enclosed. So
yeah, you're right. It's like this artificial thing.
Yeah,
that's a very good point.
And I'm wondering if it's also representative of what you were saying about the dialectic, the political dialectic that's being delivered.
That's great. That's a really great point. I think you're right.
There's a paper in there somewhere, I think.
You should write this paper.
But yeah, so we don't have any questions from the audience, and I don't know if you wanted to make maybe some last observations to our audience, or some maybe thoughts for people to carry away.
Yeah, sure. And I'll just scroll through see it all again.
Especially, I like the fact that you brought up women's reproductive rights. We know,
oh yes,
you know, what's happened since, and even what's happening in Iran right now.
Yep. Yeah. I think it's interesting, then, especially in the United States right now with affirmative action as well. Like this kind of, we're living in we lived in this post-racial discourse for so long, and now it's very clear that we don't live in nobody really believed we lived in, I hope nobody really believed we lived in a post-racial society in the US, but that myth at least has been violently ripped away, and that people have to face the reality of it. And I think everything that this film was kind of gesturing toward when it came out has really manifested even more violently since then, right? And now the big question is, I forgot how many years it is that Pennywise comes back. I think it's 25 years or something, every 25 years or something like that. But the question is are we going to have the return of Pennywise as president again in, a couple of years, right? And that's kind of the fear, right? And so I think about that question as well in relationship to this reading of Trump as this kind of figure of the clown and how it came out, in concert with La Llorona. And if Trump, the clown figure, the Pennywise president comes back, will La Llorona return even more?
Yeah. I have a colleague, I think, that works in vampires and werewolves. And she has mentioned in past work that there's a cycle in pop culture when there's a resurgence of vampires, which pairs up with a political alignment. And then when that wave of pop culture's interest in vampires wanes, there's a rise in the werewolf personification, and that reflects a different political wave. So recently, AMC here in Canada has released Interview with a Vampire as a television series.
Oh, yeah.
And Anne Rice was alive for the first few episodes, but she did pass during filming. And they're really engaging with some of the points you made here today about queerness, about race, because Louis is actually a Black queer man. So it really is
a big departure from Brad Pitt.
Yeah, slightly. So I find it's engaging with many of the points you pointed out with La Llorona. And I think what it's representative, our pop culture reflects, like you said about monsters earlier in your paper, our monsters represent our fears in the moment, in our society, in our historical time period, our anxieties, our fears. And the fact that some of the points you brought up is around masculinity, is around this incel movement. So it is representative of some of the questions we are asking right now.
Yeah, definitely. I want to see this show because I'm a big Interview with the Vampire fan.
Yes. It's pretty good so far. It's engaging with some good questions. And I think based on your presentation here today, I think you'll have a lot to say. So
great.
At this moment, if everyone seemed to be too shy to ask the questions. I do want to say thank you very much for presenting and being our first presenter of the Film Club and sharing your thoughts and your research on some really interesting questions we have to take away and maybe reflect on with our current position in the world and where the world is right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much for inviting me, Dr. Santos. And I'm so sorry that y'all didn't get to see the PowerPoint till the end.